I'm going to kind of, again, on the theme of greenhouse gas emissions and related to the meetings that are ongoing now related to addressing climate change. Just take a little look through Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the good things about doing this now is the 2021 report about the emissions actually came out fairly recently. And that gives data up to 2019, which is about the most recent that you're going to get. And what I want to emphasize here is these are greenhouse gas emissions divided up by sector. So different kinds of industries. Is there actually a pointer up here that works now?
The actual pointer that works.
Oh. Not really. That's okay. But everyone can see that there anyway. The transport is a very large section, and that's something I'm going to talk a little bit about more. Obviously, there's a very large piece that is our oil and gas industry. And to be clear, that is not the emissions from combustion of that oil and gas later somewhere else, as most of it is exported, or the emissions that come when it's combusted in one of the other categories. Those are the emissions from the industry itself that produces that product. So obviously there's a big chunk there. Electricity, for the amount of it that we use, is actually relatively low, and that's because we have such a large percentage of hydroelectricity in Canada. And then buildings is pretty big, heavy industry is pretty big. And then agriculture and waste, those are actually non-energy sources, so largely methane emissions and so on. I just put that up for context because, as I've said, I'm going to argue that we need to take a more ambitious look at the transport sector. And part of the reason that I am suggesting that is related to this, which is from the same report. This is our national inventory report, and it shows between 2005 and 2019, have the changes been in our emissions in Canada. And the farthest left in the yellow is our total change, which is a very small 1.1% drop. So our emissions have gone down a little bit. However, obviously we need them to go down a lot more than that. So we're not there yet. But if you look at what happened, a lot of categories went down a little. Stationary combustion went down a lot. Now the category of stationary combustion is largely power plants and heating plants and furnaces, or it's anything that is obviously stationary and is burning a fuel. The very biggest single action that would show up in that reduction as a visible bar is when by 2014, 2015, the province of Ontario had eliminated coal-fired power generation. You could actually see that's considered to be the largest single action reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Canada so far. But there's a lot of others, and Nova Scotia counts too. Nova Scotia's actually been doing a really progressive job at switching away from coal. We started in the 2010s at 85% coal-fired power generation, and we're now down to 60, which is still a lot, but it's continuing to go down, and that's actually quite a large change. We'll see that in a moment. But what is the kind of elephant in the room here is that energy used in transport just keeps going up and up, and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. And that is kind of, it's made more clear here in terms of what is going on. So this is a chart from the same report. Road transportation. So that is cars, trucks, freight trucks. It's both personal and freight, but it's everything that goes down a road. So the public transit buses and so on would be included in here, but they would be a tiny, tiny fraction of it. Road transportation's greenhouse gas emissions have just been rising and rising and rising. If you look at every other category, off-road has stayed roughly the same, you see the thickness, and the rest aviation, railways, marine, and pipeline transport have always been quite small and haven't changed that much. So it sort of makes it very clear kind of where the big increases are. And it's simple reason, longer distances, more vehicles, both in terms of freight and in personal transportation. And this despite considerable increases in the efficiency of how those vehicles operate. And that's one of the kind of almost paradoxes of our time. I have a friend who likes to show a nice picture of two cars facing each other. And one was, I think, built in 1965, and the other one was built in, I think, 2015 or something. Then they have exactly the same fuel consumption per 100 kilometers. And the reason is the new one has a super much more efficient engine, and it has all the technological advancements. It's heavier, it's bigger, it's got all of these extra accessories in it. It still uses just as much fuel as this little car that was built a long time ago. There's a lot of interesting kind of paradoxes in the situation that we face. But these are all kind of why I'm making this emphasis on transportation, and I'll talk about that a little bit more further on. But what I wanted to, and I alluded to this earlier, is that in Nova Scotia, and actually in all of Atlantic Canada, we have already been reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So you may or may be aware of this, but these are, the orange at the top is Newfoundland, which basically hasn't really changed since 2005 on this scale. Oh, just to explain the scale, it's emissions as a percent of 2005 emissions. So the emissions in 2005 are 100%. So any reduction shows us going down, staying the same is flat. And then there are other provinces that are not shown here that have gone up, which is why the second line down, the blue one, is Canada for comparison. So the whole country of Canada has only gone down a little bit, really hardly much at all. But that's because in Canada, we have a mixture of provinces that have gone down a lot. Like New Brunswick has managed a 38% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for 2005 levels. That's impressive. I mean, that's a big reduction. Nova Scotia, about a 30% reduction. And that was actually our legislative target, which we met like 5 years earlier, I think. So pretty good. Prince Edward Island hasn't gone down as much, but there's some really interesting things about Prince Edward Island. A lot of the energy in Prince Edward Island, well, especially the electricity, comes directly from New Brunswick anyway. So it's kind of a branch circuit off New Brunswick, so it's very much connected. Which means that a lot of the changes that happen in the electricity system do not show up as a reduction in Prince Edward Island's emissions. They show up as a reduction in New Brunswick's emissions. That said, Prince Edward Island does have a lot of wind power installed, so they're actually doing pretty well. I left it out because of time and just it's too complicated, but you can do the same chart with all 10 provinces and the territories on it. And you see there's 4 provinces that have increased a fair bit, and that's what makes it level. Ontario has also decreased a fair bit, as I mentioned. So long story short, we're actually, relatively speaking, we've been doing pretty well in Atlantic Canada in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And now I'm going to actually dig into some of the research that our own team did. And I really love this. It was a little research project that we hired a student to do. Vijaya Lakshmi Isakimutu, who was a student in DAL at the time at the School for Resource and Environmental Studies, and studied the energy consumption pattern of Nova Scotia in 2017. And take a deep breath. There's a very, very complicated chart coming. Okay. And
It's quite beautiful.
yeah, it's lovely, isn't it? Lots of colors, lots of lines. And I didn't really consider that there was going to be like a bar across the top, but all.
I think you can move it.
I can move that bar. Well, I don't necessarily have to. because all it says is Sankey diagram of energy flow from Nova Scotia. So none of the real information is underneath that bar. And it's from, the data is from 2017. And that's one of the kind of unfortunate parts, is that we started this in 2019 and the data was only available up to 2017. But it's still fairly representative. I mean, it hasn't changed that much in the past 4 years. So first of all, what is a Sankey diagram? Now, some of you will have seen them in other fields or in energy. What they are is a flow diagram. So they work from left to right, and they show in any system what's coming in, that's from the left, where is it going, how is it being changed and processed, that's the stuff in the middle, and then where is it ending up, how's it, what's happening when it goes out the other end. And I find them very useful for considering the pattern of an energy system and thinking about what's going on in that energy system. So this is for Nova Scotia. And what you see is along the left, and I'll backtrack a bit. Again, thanks to Vijaya, who did the work on it with our team's guidance. A lot of sources, a lot of digging through Statistics Canada. The sources are listed down there. So this is basically an exercise in visualization of statistics. And what you see along the left is the energy coming in, and you see the categories: wind, domestic hydroelectricity, so that's the small hydroelectric dams that we do have in Nova Scotia, natural gas, coal, petcoke, which is it's a byproduct of refining of petroleum products, and it can be burned as a fuel. It's not that different from coal in its effects. Biomass, which is in Nova Scotia largely tree matter or forest matter. Solar is appearing for the first time on there. You can see the number is very small. It's this little orange line down there. Hopefully you can see it. And then refined petroleum products. So that's basically mostly fuel oil, diesel fuel, and gasoline. The total input to Nova Scotia is roughly 244 petajoules. Now, all of this, of course, a little bit approximate, but and if you go through the numbers, 86% of what is coming in is a fossil fuel. In terms of energy, 86% of the energy entering is in the form of a fossil fuel. That immediately, and this is why I love these diagrams, it immediately tells you, if you're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, kind of where are the big things and where to focus your attention. And in some ways, that's fairly obvious. Like, most people would be aware that the burning of coal for electricity is a pretty high emission activity, and is a large part of the energy. Now, the coal is that gray line, fairly thick, that goes into electricity combustion generation. But the other enormous one is the refined petroleum products. So coming in, and as you can see, they go to their distribution. Now then you've got 98 petajoules there, 99 almost. And a small arm of it goes off to residential heating, and even smaller to industrial and commercial institutional. So that's the fuel oil. But a very, very large portion heads off to transport. And in a sense, all these things are obvious, but it's nice to see them all together on a graph because it just makes things so clear. And then in the middle, you see where they go, like passenger transport, freight transport, et cetera, commercial, residential, industrial. But what I most find illustrative or enlightening about this is looking at the far end, the right side end, and the fact that 62% of the energy that is entered goes out as wasted heat. And again, there's nothing. It's not like we're doing something wrong with that energy. That's how combustion equipment works. It gives off a lot of waste heat based by basic thermodynamics. And really, what this visualization makes clear is that there are just two really big sources of that wasted heat. And that is all the heat coming off of the vehicles, basically the transportation, that's one arm up from the bottom. And the heat coming off of the electric power generation plants. I like looking at that way because when they look at a system like this and say, well, how are we going to reduce this? How are we going to meet goals to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? To recognize that combustion is at the same time as that large source of wasted heat, it is the highest portion of the greenhouse gas emissions as well. And since that wasted heat is by definition not doing anything useful for us, so to me it seems like a really good place to start in terms of if you need to make a reduction, because that's not changing the level of service to anyone. If you find a way to provide the same service without wasting so much heat from combustion. So just a little summary of what is there, and I really have said most of this, but 62% of the energy used in Nova Scotia is rejected as waste heat, and 2 activities alone account for 83% of that rejected energy. Combustion of fuel to generate electricity, and that's mostly coal, and combustion of fuel for transportation, and that's primarily petroleum. So what we did was we took this a step farther, and we prepared a scenario. It really more of a thought exercise, and I'll talk about the fact that this will be in what I'm about to speak about is in no way a prediction, and neither is it a prescription. It's not saying what I think will happen or what I think should happen, but it's what if this did happen, and that is if we eliminated coal from electricity generation. Now that one's obvious enough. That's already in legislation. Federally, the goal was to eliminate all coal-fired generation in Canada by 2030. Nova Scotia asked for kind of an exception, they call an equivalency agreement, to keep using it longer, but to make more reductions in other parts of the system to make up for it. But the second one, which I think is going to be a newer idea and perhaps more kind of worthy of discussion, is can we convert a very large proportion of our transport to running on electricity as its energy carrier. And obviously that is not going to happen overnight. So let's say between now and 2040, because vehicles have a lifetime and they need to run for a while before they get replaced. But so I asked, Vijaya and I and the team, we asked ourselves this question, just what would it look like? How would that change things if we did those 2 things? So this, as I said, is a hypothetical scenario, neither a prescription nor a prediction. But firstly, what we did was we took just the section about electricity. So just kind of simplify it. So this is a cut out of the same diagram, but it's only that part that was about electricity. Okay, so electricity used to have a lot of coal, natural gas, and so on. We just said, what if you took all of that out? So you see there's no more coal or natural gas coming in or oil, but what has it been replaced with? And this very simplistic scenario, we generating the same amount of electricity as we were in 2017. We could argue maybe we're going to need more electricity, maybe we're going to need less. There's a whole field in and of itself. Nova Scotia's electricity has dropped by more than 10% since 2010. And that's partly efficiency, the work of Efficiency Nova Scotia has helped a lot of things become more efficient. Also, a couple of key industries that used a lot of electricity either ratcheted back or shut down their operations. So we actually already generate less electricity now than we did 10 years ago. But obviously that could change a lot as electric vehicles come on and so on. But for the sake of having a scenario to work with, we said, well, let's generate the same amount of electricity, but let's largely replace the coal and the natural gas and the oil with wind energy. So more wind energy, that's 3 times as much wind energy as what we have now, and imported hydroelectricity, which in 2017, we weren't importing much hydroelectricity. That's becoming more possible now that the Maritime Link is operating. But this is just a very basic idea. Take the fossil fuels out and replace them with wind power and hydropower. Why that combination? Because wind power we're pretty confident we can install that many wind turbines, there's space and so on. But it varies so